Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Perry Worldhouse. My name is Michael Weisberg. I'm the director this year. I want to thank you for joining today's edition of The World Today. This is co-sponsored between Perry Worldhouse and the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. And so thank you to our wonderful partners at the center, and I think this is going to be a really terrific event. So as I think all of you know, on January 13th, the people of Taiwan elected William Lai as of the Democratic Progressive Party as their next president. After serving as vice president for the past 4 years, Lai will have to address a number of foreign policy challenges, including a deteriorating relationship with the People's Republic of China, a United States interested in preventing a cross-Strait conflict, and countries around the globe seeking the expansion of Taiwan's semiconductor industry. So at home, President-elect Lai will also grapple with a number of urgent issues, including youth unemployment, economic diversification, the rising cost of living and housing, and the future of energy policy, and all of that without a majority for his party in a divided parliament. So how will the new president confront these concerns, both domestically and abroad? And are there prospects for deeper cross-strait cooperation between Taipei and Beijing? How might the election impact the Indo-Pacific region and beyond? These are huge questions, and the panel today are among the most expert people in the world to help us think through these questions. So I'm really pleased to welcome today 3 amazing panelists with vast experience in Taiwan and cross-strait relations, who are both practitioners and academics. So let me tell you about our speakers for the day. So the first will be Jacques Delisle, who's the Stephen Kozin Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. His research and teaching focus on contemporary Chinese law and politics, including legal reform and its relationship to economic reform, and the political change in China, the international status of Taiwan, cross-strait relations, China's engagement with the international order, legal and political issues in Hong Kong under Chinese rule, and US-China relations. And Jacques is also a longtime participant of Perry Worldhouse, and it's really wonderful to welcome him back, and as I said before, to have this joint event with his center. Our other guests are Susan Thornton. She's a senior fellow at Yale Law School, and she's a retired senior U.S. diplomat with almost 3 decades of experience in the U.S. State Department in both the Eurasian region and East Asia. She is also the director of the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and she's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Our third panelist is Vincent Wang, who's the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Adelphi University in New York City. He's Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Asia program, and the author of over 80 scholarly articles and book chapters on Asian political economy, security, international relations, East Asian Latin American cooperative development, Taiwan's foreign policy and domestic politics, as well as cross-strait relations, Chinese politics, China-Indian relations, and India-US relations. The discussion today will be moderated by our own Thomas Shattuck. He's our senior program manager, and his research focuses on cross-strait relations, Taiwanese and Chinese domestic and foreign affairs, the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, and the US's changing and growing role in the Indo-Pacific. Tom is a non-resident research fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute, a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and a member of Foreign Policy for America's Next Gen Foreign Policy Initiative. So thank you all for being here today, and please join me in welcoming our speakers and our moderator.
All right, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Michael, for that kind introduction. Before we get to the moderated conversation, I'll just give kind of a lay of the land of where we are after the election a couple of weeks ago. So as Michael said, the current vice president of Taiwan, William Lai, was elected to be president. He'll take office in May. This marks the first time that a political party in Taiwan, while it was a democracy, has won 3 straight terms as president. William Lai won the presidential election with only 40% of the vote, however. He defeated former Taipei mayor and chair of the Taiwan People's Party, Mayor Ko Wen-je, who got 26% of the vote. The Kuomintang candidate and new Taipei City Mayor Hou Yu-ih, he got 33% of the vote. some kind of characterization of the parties and acronyms so you know them ahead of time. The Democratic Progressive Party is the DPP. They are more of a pro-Taiwan, China skeptic party. So when you hear DPP, that's what that means. The Kuomintang is the KMT. They are the longtime power in Taiwan, and they favor cross-strait exchange in a way that the DPP may not necessarily. And the Taiwan People's Party, the TPP, not the DPP, is a new party focused more on technocratic local governance across Taiwan. That's the presidential side. They also had a legislative election. So Taiwan's legislative yuan holds 113 seats. That requires 57 seats to have a majority in the legislature. The KMT won 52 seats, the DPP won 51 seats, and the TPP won 8 seats, and there are 2 other independents that kind of focus more towards the KMT side. What this means is that no party has actually a true majority, and that the TPP holds the keys to whoever wants to maintain a majority and push forward some sort of legislative agenda. And as we speak, they're both the DPP and KMT are meeting with the TPP to gain their support to decide who is going to have the Speaker of the LY. And as we know in the United States, the Speaker of the House can be a very stable or unstable position. So it is a very important, negotiations are going on right now in Taiwan. But between now and May, Tsai Ing-wen will remain president of Taiwan, and then in May, William Lai will take over. So with that out of the way, I'm going to start with you, Vincent. If you could walk us through the campaign cycle here, because we have 3 parties that actually had somewhat legitimate chances of winning the presidency. So how did we get from, let's say, summer last year to where we are now in January?
Sure. First of all, thank you, University of Pennsylvania, for inviting me. I was very fortunate to have visited Taiwan during this time. So now I'm putting on a scarlet hat to talk about the election in Taiwan. So to start off, that the people in Taiwan are eligible to participate in 11 elections altogether. And since 2012, they simplified into 2 elections in terms of timing. So one is the general election, which is the one that Tom just talked about, January 13th, which consists of president, vice president, a single ticket, and the legislative yuan, which is their parliament. And the other 9 are the so-called local elections, or sometimes known as 9-in-1, which does happen in 2022. The voter eligibility, in order to vote for president and vice president, the voter must have so-called household registration in the Taiwan area for at least 6 months. Overseas, Taiwanese can register to vote. I'll comment on that in a little bit. In the legislative yuan, they need to have household registration for 4 months. And then there are also Aborigines. There are 6 seats for Aborigines that only Aboriginal people can vote. Talking about the expatriate suffrage, in Taiwan, it might be interesting to know that Taiwan election laws currently still do not provide for absentee ballot. The only way you can vote is actually to go back to where your household registration is to vote. So every 4 years, that hundreds, if not thousands of overseas Taiwanese actually make the trek to go back. So how many exactly went this year? It's hard to imagine. I read somewhere that there are an estimated 700,000 Taiwanese Americans living in the United States. And of course, for them, the attachment to the homeland is very strong, and they also hope that it will play a positive role in strengthening U.S.-Taiwan relations. This year, according to the Central Election Commission, about 4,000 overseas Taiwanese actually registered to vote. But then I use one other indicator to estimate just how many people actually went back to vote. So on the election eve, that the local news reported using the airport statistics. So on the last few days prior to the election, about 12,000 people actually made the trip to go back to vote. So I will characterize the Taiwanese election, judging it according to one very important criterion, which is if we are seeing this as sort of a larger picture, we want to ask whether the Taiwanese people can exercise free and fair election. I think this is very important. And I would say that there are a few aspects that we can judge this. So first of all, the Taiwanese elections are now, ever since 1996, when Taiwan became a full democracy, this is the 8th time, and that people are relatively used to it, even though the election received a lot of attention, particularly in the United States. But people in Taiwan generally just go about doing their things. This is like another day, like we have colleagues, Jacques, or also in Taiwan, maybe Tom was in Taiwan at that time, they can attest to that. So I will highlight just a few characteristics. Maybe when we think about the future of democracy in this country or around the world, that we can actually maybe consider these characteristics. First of all, is that I think the Taiwan elections do a very good job of educating the electorate, because democracy is about informed citizenry, that can exercise their free will and they can express their will, and that the political parties can stand on level playing field. So in terms of this, that the Central Election Commission actually sponsors televised presidential and vice presidential debates prior to election. So that's very informative. And then also that the Central Election Commission will send out these. So I actually maintain the household registration. So I receive these. What are these? Depending on what kind of ballots you can vote. I casted 3 ballots. So this one is, the first one is the presidential and vice presidential. So it tells the voters the major candidates, their number 1, 2, 3. 1 is the TPP candidate, the ticket. 2 is the DPP ticket, and 3 is the KMT ticket. Their names, their images, so even illiterate people can vote. And then, their educational background, their experience, and then their major policy platforms. So the second thing I received, I voted for the district legislator. So this is my district legislator gazette. And the third one, I voted in the party list, which is a proportional representation. So depending on your franchise, that you get a lot of voter material, sort of I would say, relatively non-biased, informative. So that's one thing that I think is very interesting. And another thing is that the Taiwanese election authority imposed a 10-day blackout period. So all the opinion polls have to stop 10 days prior to the election. The result, the purpose is actually to not to sway public opinions. And as it turned out that the final vote results very resemble the sort of the final polls allowed in 10 days prior to the election. The second characteristic I'll point out is convenience. The Taiwanese elections are really convenient. First of all, the election takes place on a Saturday, which is a holiday. So people can travel, because the only way you can vote is actually go back to your home to vote. So you can imagine this is one of the largest peacetime migration of people on high-speed rail and all kinds of transportation. According to the Central Election Commission, this time about 19.5 million eligible voters. And in order to make it easier for people to vote and to count votes, they divide the country into 17,794 polling stations or precincts. So this, if you do the math, these precincts are conveniently located, like at community centers or elementary schools and so on. So on average, each precinct handles about 1,095 votes. In some Aboriginal areas, it can be as few as 200 votes. So counting is actually very quick. I will point this out later. So on average, voters spend about 5 to 10 minutes to vote. So it's very convenient. You don't have to form a long line and so on. A third characteristic I will point out is the transparency. First of all, they check the voter identification. Voters need to bring their voter notice, their ID card, and their personal seal. If they don't have the seal, they can sign. And after they verify your identity, they will give you the ballots, and you vote, and you leave. And then prior to the exercising the voting, they ask people to inspect the ballot box. One time, I was the second in line, so they asked me to look at the boxes. So I said, see, there's no stuffed boxes, right? And the third is, that after 4 o'clock, the voting is from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., only 8 hours. But right after 4 o'clock, the place where you vote becomes the place where you count the votes. And the counting of the votes is actually very interesting. The one election worker will pull up a ballot, say, Lai Ching-te 一票, one ballot for Lai Ching-te, and 侯友宜一票, one ballot for 侯友宜. And the second worker will mark it on the blackboard, and the third worker will actually tally the results, and pretty soon all the results, remember there are about 17,000 precincts, they all send the data to the Central Election Commission. So by around 8 o'clock, it's very efficient. By around 8 o'clock, a nation of close to 20 million franchise, we know the results already. I already mentioned the efficiency. And obviously, I think that there are also some areas for improvement, I would say. The one is that there has been debate, in fact, a constitutional amendment to lower the voting age from 20 to 18, and that didn't pass. So far, the voters in Taiwan cannot vote until 20, which is, I think it can be improved. The second is the provision of absentee ballot. I think that a lot of countries around the world have allowed that, including the United States. But I've talked to some politicians. The way I look at it is that there are some partisan calculations, because the Green camp thinks that the ones that will benefit from the absentee ballot are primarily the Taiwanese businessmen working in China. And these are more likely to be blue supporters. But there's actually no empirical evidence for that. And so therefore, until that can happen, that overseas Taiwanese still have to trek to go back this once every 4 years routine. So this is sort of a very quick overview of the election process. And it's really a very exciting and inspiring exercise of democracy.
Speaking of making the trek to Taiwan, Jacques, you were over there the week of the election. You met with the various members of both or all three political parties. What can you tell us about your trip and what you learned?
Well, as I've been doing for, I think, the last several cycles of presidential and legislative elections, we're there meeting with, as you say, people from all the major parties, candidates, civil society organizations, and things like that. It was in some ways a not terribly dramatic cycle. The results were more or less as predicted. That is that the DPP would win, but not win with a majority in the presidential election, and that the legislature would wind up with the DPP losing seats to the KMT, but probably nobody getting a majority. So all that was relatively unexciting. What was striking about it is, as you mentioned, this is the first time that one party has held presidential office for 3 terms in a row. That is new. And it raises concerns about whether the KMT, the Kuomintang, will right the ship. They've lost 3 in a row, and they, have, I think, not yet come up with a clear path back to success. There was a lot of talk about generational divides, and so Kulinja, the 3rd place finisher with the new TPP party, is believed to have attracted significant support from younger voters who could never see themselves voting for the KMT because that's the old Chiang Kai-shek party. It's too conservative on a lot of social policies. It's too cozy with China in their view. But they are dissatisfied with the DPP because people who are in their 20s have really no adult memory of a non-DPP government. So everything that voters are dissatisfied with with, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction among voters. For the younger folks, is visited entirely on the DPP. It is for everyone to some degree because they've been in power for 8 years, but especially for youth who voted very heavily for the DPP for Tsai Ing-wen when she ran for re-election 4 years ago, particularly in the shadow of the crackdown in Hong Kong. And that's what drove the last election. In 2016, Tsai Ing-wen was in serious trouble for re-election. The now president-elect Lai Ching-te, her vice president, actually tried to unseat her in the primaries, which is quite remarkable. But that issue is now faded, and it really was this sort of strange dynamic to the election. And I'll just say two of them that I think are worth mentioning. One is if you look at opinion polls, the things that were at the top of voters' lists were the kind of issues that Michael mentioned in his introduction. They are things like housing costs, economic transformation, and what's Taiwan's next act, how is decoupling between the US and China going to affect Taiwan's economy, social issues, how are you going to pay for healthcare costs in an aging population and things like that, the nuclear power issue, because they're trying to decommission nuclear power plants for all the environmental reasons, but it raises energy security issues, especially given the prospect that China would disrupt energy supplies. So that's very much on the agenda. Cross-strait issues were up there, but they weren't at the top of the list. And yet much of what came to be the focus down the stretch of the campaign really was cross-strait issues. And there really wasn't that much difference. Both parties were pledging a position on cross-strait policies. It was basically protecting the status quo. Yes, the KMT remained more focused on trying to reestablish better ties with China, reopen dialogue, deepen economic ties again, and the DPP was much more, let's align with fellow democracies, let's get close to the US, Japan, and others. But really, in terms of the nuts and bolts of cross-straits, continuity was the theme. The KMT is miles away from where it used to be in terms of rapprochement with China, even the Ma Ying-jeou era, the last KMT president. And Lai, despite having said some things that sound a little deep green, a little pro-independence, has pledged very strongly to continue the existing policy. So that was one dynamic. The other is the three-party dynamic, which is Kalinja, this sort of independent mayor of Taipei who has been former mayor of Taipei, has been kind of all over the map. He started out being supported by the DPP in his first run, wound up then saying things which sounded very KMT-like on cross-strait relations, and then in the campaign itself took on a bit of a tone of, I'm the smartest guy in the room, I can figure out how to fix everything, but was rather vague and inconsistent in policies. There was a last-minute effort to do a unity ticket, to get the so-called white-blue unification, which is the KMT with the TPP, to beat the DPP. That fell apart largely over the fact that neither one of the two candidates in that potential alignment was willing to play second fiddle. Kalinja has, I think, too big an ego and sees himself as too major a figure to take second place. And the KMT institutionally would be in even worse trouble if it wound up being number 2 on a ticket with an upstart party. So I was skeptical that deal was ever going to work. It blew up fairly spectacularly. The former president, Ma Ying-jeou, tried to broker it, and it really blew up on live TV, which was kind of embarrassing. So what happened was you had this split vote. And the reason I'm sort of belaboring this a little bit is you now have this party that has 26%, the popular vote, and has the 8 swing seats in the legislature, and is going to announce apparently tomorrow which side it's going to back for the parliamentary speaker. Where would those votes have gone? And so one of the things going forward is to figure out what this third force means, how durable it is. I think there's reason to be skeptical about whether this is a party that can institutionalize in a meaningful way. If you look at their legislative members, they really run the gamut from people who are deeper green, the DPP, people in the so-called New Power Party that came out of the Sunflower Movement, the student protests several years ago, to people who look very KMT. How do they hang together? I don't know. But they're one of the many challenges facing the KMT is that I don't think they've fully reflected on the nature of their defeat. I think there's still too much talk about how those Kalinja voters would have been our voters. So if only we'd been able to unite, we would have won a majority and kept the seats. There's, I think, a sense that they don't have to do any really deep introspection, and until they do that, they've got a problem. They've got a huge youth problem. So I think, if you look 10, 15 years down the road, they have some promising younger politicians, but for right now, they're in trouble. And one sign of that is their candidate for Speaker of the legislature is Han Kuo-yu, who lost disastrously as their presidential candidate 4 years ago, and who is a weird combination of to the far pro-China end of mainstream opinion in Taiwan, and a kind of populist, vaguely Trumpy character.
And Susan, you were in China when Taiwan had its elections earlier this month. So can you talk about what reaction, if any, you noticed on the ground there?
Yeah, sure. And again, thank you so much, Tom, and to UPenn for having me here today. I think it's really fantastic to be able to be up here with such auspicious and knowledgeable guests. I have actually observed elections in all kinds of places around the world, and to hear the descriptions and see the conduct of this election, I guess I'd have to start off with the positives, which is these elections are really well run in Taiwan. I mean, you had the concession of the opposition figures, candidates, come very early. It was very smooth. So, hats off and kudos to, I definitely agree with Vincent that there are areas to be improved, and I'll talk about one of those in a second. But this is really the kind of election you want, 75% turnout, which, we would love to have here in the US, I think. So it really shows a lot of civic engagement in Taiwan, and the education of the population, as you mentioned, is really laudable. Another, I would say, positive thing was the fact that even though there was a lot of talk about, interference in the election, frankly speaking, the polls, going back months and then all the way up until right before the election and then the actual result, pretty much it went exactly as had been predicted. So it seems clear that whatever interference may or may not have been designed or thought of didn't really have much effect. And it's also, I think, helpful to note that there were no surprises. Sometimes in Taiwan elections, there are last-minute surprises. We had the shooting of Chen Shui-bian back in the early 2000s, which had a big impact on that election. So there can be things that come up, and I think this was a case that all went according to plan, and that's all to the good. Another very positive thing was the response to the election, and I landed in Beijing the day of the election and had meetings that week with many people on cross-strait issues. And I think, first of all, Lai Ching-te's victory speech was very, I thought, kind of moderated. He offered an olive branch kind of to Beijing. He said he would, follow cross-strait policies. He talked about, Taiwan as a model democracy, but, he talked about support for cross-strait exchanges, which, many people might not have expected him to do. So I thought his speech was both non-provocative and also offering, an opening to Beijing. Beijing's response was also, in the immediate aftermath of the election, contrary to what many people expected or worried about, was also quite moderate. Both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Taiwan Affairs Office made statements. The Taiwan Affairs Office statement was in the vein of, well, in the election, we see that 60% of the people did not vote for Lai Ching-te, and therefore they are supportive of the status quo, and therefore our approach is working, so we can afford to continue our kind of very purposeful and determined approach to continue toward reunification. We don't need to change what we're doing or do anything drastic. And I think that was, for Beijing, convenient that they could play it that way, and for others, kind of reassuring that Beijing wasn't going to, react in some way very dramatically and problematically. So, of course, we did see a number of things happen in the period of time after the election to sort of signal Beijing's worry and displeasure over, Lai Ching-te being elected. And we know that he certainly was not their favorite candidate. But, we saw them switch, pull the trigger on the switch in diplomatic recognition of one of Taiwan's remaining 13 diplomatic allies, countries that actually recognize Taiwan instead of Beijing. So Nauru switched diplomatic recognition. That had obviously been, planned and long in the works, and they were just waiting for the opportunity the timing to do that. There were also some military displays not anything as dramatic as what we saw after Nancy Pelosi visited in 2022. So kind of more regular military displays. And there are a number of economic things that are also teed up and possibly in the works. So it's not that they didn't react at all, but it was much more tempered, I think, than many people thought it was going to be. And then in Washington, I would say the reaction was also quite sort of consistent, low-key, and in keeping with policies meant to reassure certainly Beijing, but I think also Taipei, and set the tone for kind of this very careful management of cross-strait issues this year during a presidential election year here. So, that is all to the good news. I think one bad news thing in some ways, and this is gonna play out, I think, going forward, is, the fact that the president-elect, leader-elect in Taiwan only got 40% of the vote, and there's no runoff in Taiwan's sort of electoral provision. So in a place that's so divided, it's kind of unfortunate. I mean, it would be helpful to have somebody in charge who's got at least a more than 50% mandate, I think. Taiwan is in a fairly precarious position still vis-a-vis the mainland and has a lot of things it needs to get done. And I think, not having a runoff or something where you can make sure that you get a majority mandate is unfortunate, and that gets to this three-party dynamic that Jacques was talking about. We don't know how that's going to play out going forward either, but I think it's maybe something to think about for the future. I don't know how they could change it to have a runoff, but that's the way a lot of countries deal with this problem when you have multiple parties running for president. And then on just going forward, I mean, I mentioned that I think all the signaling is that people want to sort of carefully manage this issue, especially with, the backdrop of bad U.S.-China relations and a volatile kind of political season coming in the U.S. It doesn't seem to me very likely that there's going to be a lot of direct interaction between the DPP and the mainland. And we've had this situation for the last 8 years under Tsai Ing-wen. If anything, Beijing is even more suspicious of Lai Ching-te than they were of Tsai Ing-wen. So it seems like a tall order to expect that something is going to drastically improve on the cross-strait interactions and communications front, which I think is unfortunate because in the absence of communication, there can be a lot of misinterpretation of signals and misunderstandings. And there is this channel of communication between the KMT and the mainland, but that is only sort of half the picture on Taiwan. And if you're not getting communication directly from the authorities that are in charge, it's more precarious, I think. So that's sort of the looking ahead, what we might be a little bit worried about. But all in all, I'd say pretty positive.
Before we get to your questions, I'm going to have a couple more. Susan, you brought up the cross-strait issue, so I'm going to bring in Vincent and Jacques on this and hear your perspectives on what you think the next 4 years will mean for cross-strait relations.
I think Susan's absolutely right on this, that the signals are continuity. There was restraint on Beijing's side. I mean, they did the usual, it's a mere provincial election, and foreign government shouldn't be interfering by congratulating and all that sort of thing. But it was really boilerplate stuff. And I would underscore the point about Lai only got 40% of the vote, right? It really was saying, we've got some time, we've got some patience. I don't think Xi Jinping has any timetable to move on Taiwan. I think it would require some sense that there was no hope ever of peaceful unification, or some accidental trigger escalating into into a crisis that nobody really wants. So I don't think Beijing is terribly interested in doing that, but Beijing will squeeze. I mean, I think we have to watch the period between now and the May 20th inaugural speech, and I assume Lai will give an inaugural speech that is in the same vein as his victory speech, in the same vein as Tsai's inaugural speeches and Chen's inaugural speeches, for that matter, with the prior DPP presidents, which is very measured. Now, I don't think that's going to lead to the clouds parting and puppies and sunshine, but it should at least keep the crisis at bay. The U.S., I think, so far has behaved well as well. I mean, did very standard things, sent some retired security officials. The congressional delegations go over, but nothing on the Nancy Pelosi scale. So everybody is trying to keep it on an even keel. And I think that's to the good. There are two wild cards out there that I would point to that could disrupt things. Well, there's a third one. Anything can happen on the Chinese side. Things are sufficiently opaque. I don't think there's a diversionary war approach. I don't think there's a timetable, but it's a little bit of a black box in how they'll play this. I think the U.S. side, the wild card, is the U.S. election. And if Trump wins, if Biden wins, very much continuity. I don't think any real change. The only issues to discuss then are, is the U.S. so distracted by Ukraine and the Middle East and such that the Taiwan issue starts to look like a back burner thing. But if it's Trump, I mean, I think you're seeing this in Europe. You'll see it very much in Asia. This concern about whether the U.S. will be there and be present, and that is whatever you think of it, a destabilizing phenomenon and a source of uncertainty. And once you introduce that, the problems that Susan was pointing to in terms of lack of cross-strait communications then becomes just the whole chessboard is scrambled in terms of trying to figure out what's going to happen. And U.S.-China relations, at least I think in the near term, would get even worse, and that's not great for Taiwan. I think Taiwan does best when U.S.-China relations are not too good or too bad, and this would be toward the other end of the spectrum. And the final one that has faded, although was very much part of the discussion before the election, was with Lai Ching-te. And if it had been Ho Yo-yi, it would have been the same story. You have a Taiwanese leader who does not have the level of experience and skill in managing cross-strait relations and relations with Washington, or the familiarity with Washington that Tsai Ing-wen and Ma Ying-jeou, her predecessor, both had from opposite parties. So we're kind of in risk of rookie mistakes, not having the degree of confidence and communication channels, which have been fine so far, and the pledges of continuity are all good, but what happens when the moments of stress come? Now, I think when Lai chose Bi Kim Xiao Mei-chin, who was the de facto ambassador equivalent to the U.S., that helped a lot, because although her sensibilities are very much like Lai's toward the deep green end of the spectrum, she knows what you can say and what you can't say. She knows how to sort of manage the relationship, and she's well known to Americans. So I think that was probably a good signal in that regard. But it's going to be a bumpy ride, I expect. Not because anybody has an agenda or anybody wants it, but there are just so many pieces in play, and on the Taiwanese side, a lack of depth of experience.
Vincent?
Just at a couple points. I think that this election probably caused Beijing to relax some of its previous assumptions. Previously, it can rely on sort of a historical or blood ties, or at least a connection with the KMT. And then the second thing they can rely on is the 8-year rotation in power. But this time, as pointed out, that this is the third time a party has held the presidency. So Beijing may conclude that it is gradually losing Taiwan, or its policy is not working. However, having said that, I also think that for the reasons that Susan mentioned, I think that Beijing is particularly keen in getting to know the DPP, because they had dialogue with the KMT, but they don't have dialogue with the DPP. So I would think that look for Lai Ching-te to take many important points or insights from President Tsai Ing-wen's inaugural speeches, particularly 2016, and give it a little bit of a new twist. I don't think that Beijing is necessarily insistent upon the DPP sticking to a so-called 1992 consensus, which was the political basis the former ruling party, KMT, forged with the CCP. But Beijing is more interested in reaching a political basis with the DPP. Whatever that is, I think that will be, has to be acceptable for both Taipei and Beijing.
I just had one quick thing that I mentioned. No, Susan's experience jives with this. My sense in the week before the election in Beijing, in conversations with people who do cross-straits issues, was they were kind of resigned to the idea that Lai was going to win. This was not a, oh, don't worry, the KMT is going to pull it out. They knew that was going to happen, and they were making plans on that basis. And secondly, there's been a growing realization in Beijing the KMT is not what the KMT used to be. That is, Hou Yu-yi was never going to be willing or able to deliver the kind of progress that they saw under Ma and hope to see more of under Ma. You just can't, if you have to answer to Taiwanese voters, be as sort of pro-Beijing, as it were, or as open to rapprochement as the KMT once was. And in fact, one of Susan said there were no surprises. That's true. The closest thing to a surprise was Ma Ying-jeou gave an interview to Deutsche Welle in which he said, oh, don't worry about China, no reason to fear, unification is a potential outcome. And I got to tell you, that was Exhibit A. Su Zhengchang, the former premier, did these last-minute last two-night rallies, and the Ma Ying-jeou, it's okay to unify thing was number one on his PowerPoint. So, I mean, that KMT is gone.
We'll now open it up to the audience here online and in person. So if you're here in person, please line up where Colleen is in the back. Colleen is representing our Zoom audience. So Colleen, first question.
Can you hear me? Okay. So first question is, can you speak to the election results and probable impacts on the wider Indo-Pacific region in terms of security, economics, etc.?
I guess that gets at the cross-strait relations issue and how worried are others in the Indo-Pacific region about, the potential for conflict. And I mean, here I would just say, and maybe, I think Jacques is right that in Beijing, the prospect of Lai winning was pretty much baked in. So the Chinese mainland side did have a lot of time to sort of think about how they would respond. And I think the region kind of breathed a sigh of relief at sort of the way all three, Taipei, Washington, and Beijing responded after the election. I think now going forward, though, it may be that Lai Ching-te will say something during his inaugural speech, and that's the thing that the rest of the region is going to now be looking to, is how is the inauguration May 20th in Taipei going to be handled by both Lai and also probably Washington, and who Washington sends to the inauguration and how it's received in Beijing. So I think, it's maybe true that Beijing may not be insisting on the 92 consensus, and Lai agreeing to that. They certainly don't expect that he would. But the idea that he'll come up with something else that will immediately be kind of accepted by Beijing, I think is also a fairly remote possibility. So what I would say people are probably expecting in the region is some perturbations over this year, both because of rhetoric that will be coming from Washington, but also I think they anticipate that Lai, with his 40% minority government and not presumably in charge of the legislative agenda, will need to, whip up support among his base and may lean on some pro-independence types of activities or rhetoric, and that may kind of create some, not major crises, but mini crises along the way this year. But I think in general, probably most countries in the region are kind of thinking that things might be okay this year. They are very worried about next year, and mostly because of the uncertainty that Jacques mentioned in the US about our elections.
How much did the pandemic and the lockdowns on mainland China affect this election, and specifically thinking about possibly the businessmen from Taiwan working in mainland, possibly other individuals working on the mainland?
So I haven't done the comparison, but I just cited the airport statistics, right? So China lifted its pandemic restrictions not long ago. And I've heard through anecdotes that many Taiwanese businessmen would rather stay put this time. How many were actually, doing that? I don't know. I think that these Taiwanese businessmen also are making a personal decision whether to come back to vote based on their assessment on the likelihood of victory by their favorite candidate, right?
Say, in the longer run, the Chinese handling of the pandemic was sort of a very minor version of the Hong Kong story. That is, people in Taiwan would say that was, you know, an extremely illiberal crackdown, and it sort of fed that narrative a little bit. But I think the pandemic and the sort of decoupling stuff that is only partly linked to that is clearly driving a lot of economic policy thinking in Taiwan. What happens if US-China decoupling goes forward? What happens as all these companies do the China plus one strategy, moving more of their production outside of the mainland? And there's been this real attempt, policy attempt out of the DPP government to make Taiwan less economically dependent on the mainland through the new southbound policy of trying to go into Southeast Asia and through trying to onshore stuff back to Taiwan, particularly in sensitive areas. So it's part of this much broader narrative of should we be as present in China as we have been, is the question a lot of people in Taiwan are
I
asking.
think the pandemic also cut all the cross-strait flights, and they have not been restored. So there were, was it 70 flights a week back and forth, and they have not.
More than 500 flights a day.
Oh my gosh, so it has not been restored to that level, so it's more expensive, it's more problematic to get travel back and forth now.
Colleen?
All right, next question from the online audience. What kinds of steps may Beijing take to build its diplomatic success with Nauru? Should we expect to see stronger efforts to flip, Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, and Palau?
Well, the Marshall Islands and Palau both have reaffirmed continuing ties with Taiwan. Palau just had was it Palau? No, Tuvalu just had an election where it looked like the Taiwan skeptic, Beijing-friendly candidates was not a core issue in their election, was part of it. Made some gains, but it looks like, at least according to Taiwan's assessment, that's not likely to lead to a flip. Both Palau and Marshall Islands expressed continuing support. Marshall Islands just had a presidential transition where the new president made those noises. But this is one of the items in Beijing's toolkit, is to poach diplomatic partners. They're down to a dozen now. If you're into obscure flags, if you're an expert vexillologist, I suggest you go to the lobby of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Taipei. You can tell what those flags are. You're ahead of most people. And it's kind of lonely. I mean, it is down to the dozen. I actually don't think it's a great idea for Beijing to squeeze too hard on that. There is a risk that you back Taiwan a bit into a corner. Susan mentioned the risk of Lai Ching-te sort of playing the deep green base. I think the more Taiwan gets cornered, or the more Lai is cornered, and Beijing's very worried about 4 years from now too, when Lai's running for re-election if he has to play to the base. But squeezing on diplomacy could accelerate that. And I think Taiwan ultimately at some point will have an opportunity to code switch. If you really squeeze them to practically no diplomatic partners, they can say, okay, the heck with formal diplomatic recognition. We're talking about the fact that we have an incredibly robust informal presence around the world. That's the second best solution, but it's it's I think where they wind up going. The real cost there is that one of Taiwan's attempts to push back against Beijing's pressure on the One China principle and things like that is that these formal diplomatic partners play important roles in raising the issue in the UN and elsewhere in the international organization. So that card would be removed from their deck.
Hi. So all three of you mentioned the importance of the 40% vote that he got, so he doesn't have a majority in the legislature. Could you talk about some material issues that might stall? Especially semiconductors, is it going to have any impact on that?
Great. I'll start with, I share Susan's concern about the governability, about the Lai only winning at 40%, and no party has actually a majority in the legislature. But I'm by nature optimistic, so I'm going to look at it from a different angle, which is that actually look at some of their domestic issues, which haven't received a lot of media attention, and I'm going to make an argument that some areas of agreement, which is defined by at least 2 out of the 3 major candidates have mentioned, might be an area of possible cooperation, at least rhetorically. They all both said they ought to do that. And as has been mentioned before, that one of the salient domestic issues is this sense of stagnant wages against high housing prices. There are many reasons. One is that, of course, Taiwan's economy for years has been called growth with equity. So today I'm going to emphasize the word equity. So it's been very egalitarian. I was actually struck by the fact that the prices of public transportation have not changed in many years. And then what happens is that you used to be primarily a manufacturing economy, now is coupled by high technology, financial activities, and frankly speaking, some speculative activity as well, such as real estate. So what happens is that you have an increasing inequality in income distribution. So take one example, the Gini coefficient, which measures the income inequality in Taiwan, used to be around 28 in 1980, and it risen to about 34 in 2022. Most economists say that between 20 and 35 is okay, but as you can see, Taiwan is now sort of near the acceptable range. Now, 34 is still pretty respectable, but people in Taiwan can feel that, especially coupled with sort of a unbalanced regional development. For example, housing prices in Taipei are beyond reach for young people who depend on a fixed wages, which have been stagnant for years. So not surprisingly, all three candidates talk about this issue in their campaigns, and they have advocated, for example, increasing wages, give incentive to companies that are committed to increasing the minimum wage. Hou You-yi, for example, talked about increasing the minimum wage to 33,000 NT per month, which is about $1,000, and that Lai Ching-te have talked about helping up to 1 million rental homes, through rent assistance or so-called social housing and so on. So all three candidates talk about this. I think this is one salient issue, probably one area they can cooperate, although they will want to claim political credit. The other issue that was all three candidates talked about is sort of the, etching together a more complete social safety net. This is manifested in several areas. One is that Taiwan's population is getting more older. In fact, that so-called long-term care becomes a very salient issue. All talk about increasing state resources on long-term care. On average, a Taiwanese person spends 8 years in a wheelchair or immobile. So obviously, right up to now, it's primarily family members that take care of these people, but it should be a state responsibility. At least two candidates also talk about relaxing the restrictions on how people can qualify under the so-called Barthel scale. This is a scale that tells you that who cannot take care of themselves, therefore need care, and so on. And Taiwan has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. That all three candidates talk about encouraging people to have more children. I don't think people will necessarily just respond, with $1,000 more, US dollars more assistance. Talking about 0 to 6, namely preschool, pre-K assistance, and so on. So these two issues seem to me are natural places where these three parties, none of them has majority, can probably work together, at least conceptually speaking.
So these were issues that are in the platforms and all that. Just to sort of frame it a little bit, the DPP is more of the kind of social democrat party on this sorts of things, more of a state solution, more state subsidies. The KMT is sort of more market oriented type things. But in terms of external relations, cross-straits, and foreign policy, the president has a lot of authority, a lot of discretion in those areas, but two areas where the lack of mandate and especially the legislative yuan split could show up are whether the reforms to military service are going to stick. Expanding it to 1 year is something, but not much, and the KMT has been lawfully skeptical on that. And the other is arms procurement. The arms procurement is done in the Taiwanese system through special budgets. It's not folded in with the usual budget because it's a big one-time, each cycle buying stuff from the U.S. And as Susan well knows, especially post-Ukraine, there's this real concern about how much skin Taiwan has in the game. Can it make the transition from what had been a tendency to buy fancy upper-end weapons to asymmetrical defense investments? And all those things are going to be harder to do if you have a president who can't twist arms and can't count on votes in the legislature.
Hello, thank you so much for your time. I'm curious if poaching Taiwan's diplomatic allies is going to lead to a naming issue and a de facto independence issue. Specifically, if no more allies are recognizing the Republic of China and we see more the term Taiwan being used, as is already done, and Tsai Ing-wen has been using the term Taiwan more, does this question become more salient in how independence is viewed?
I mean, I would say, and I'm sure Jacques has feelings about this too, but it's, you know, the number of countries or that there are countries sort of recognizing Taiwan over the PRC, to me, it's not really bearing directly on the sort of issues surrounding the status quo and what, you know, Tsai Ing-wen and presidents even going back before that and now Lai Ching-te call, you know, Taiwan as an de facto independent sovereign nation. So I think the ROC constitution, which is the constitution that governs Taiwan currently, and is a major issue in the maintenance of the status quo, and we can get into chapter and verse on that if you want, but we probably don't want to. But so the ROC is not going to be able to go away because that is the Taiwan Constitution. But the continuation of naming Taiwan, I mean, I don't see the diplomatic allies necessarily connecting directly to that. Where it does connect, as Jacques mentioned, is in the Taiwan's effort to expand its international space. And what that means is Taiwan's participation in the international community. And one of the things that the US and other partners of Taiwan has continually tried to promote is that, you know, Taiwan is a nation of 23 million people. You heard Vincent just go through all of the, you know, the issues, the campaign issues in Taiwan. Well, they sound an awful lot like the campaign issues here in the United States this year. I mean, it's a very developed country list of problems. And, you know, Taiwan has a lot to contribute in the world. And so, you know, what Taiwan's partners are looking for in many respects is a chance for Taiwan to make a contribution in many of the areas that it is excelling in. I mean, we've come through the pandemic now. I mean, Taiwan did a magnificent job of handling the pandemic and has a lot to contribute on health and many other areas. And, you know, the diplomatic allies in the UN and elsewhere can help with this. And so I think that's where there's worry about, you know, seeing the erosion of that. I mean, I would note that most of Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies are in Latin America, which, you know, the U.S. has a certain amount of additional influence in making sure that those allies kind of stick with Taiwan. And it also, importantly, I think does provide the wherewithal for Taiwan officials, including the president, to make transit stops in the United States on their way to formal events in those countries, and that allows us to have direct communication in many instances with, you know, authorities on Taiwan, which is helpful to managing this very complicated relationship. So, you know, that's another aspect of if all of the diplomatic allies go away, you know, we're probably going to find some way to make that, you know, transit turn into a visit. I don't know, but those are things that, you know, should be considered and probably are considered in Beijing.
We have time, I think, for one last question.
Hi, thank you all for being here. So I'm curious about your view on how the challenges in China economy right now, like the rise in unemployment rate, weakening growth, and so on, gonna impact their attitude towards the cross-strait relationship?
Get something quick. There are two thoughts here. One is that one school of thought, optimists, will say that China's economy is in deep trouble, so it is very internally preoccupied. Therefore, they will not regard sort of the tension with Taiwan as high in priority. This is one school of thought. The other is that precisely because their economy is in trouble, so therefore, in order to divert their attention, that the leader may take some risky move. But I think it will be a very reckless move, and just, conceptually, there are two possibilities.
And I would just follow on that and say that with respect to the two possibilities, I would certainly lean toward the former. I don't see many signs, and I think Jacques alluded to this earlier, that there's going to be a kind of a effort to distract from problems at home and lash out and start a war in a kind of wag the dog scenario. But, if we talk about U.S.-China relations, we also see that U.S.-China relations now has come back to a point where there's a lot more engagement and interaction between the two, and I think that also is related to the fact that the Chinese leadership sees that it has a lot of issues to work on at home, including especially, and as top priority, the economic difficulties and trying to find and navigate a way through that and make improvements.
I'd agree. I think the first option is far more likely, and one of the things that is a lesson of the recent months or years in U.S.-China relations, and particularly in one of the few applicable lessons from Ukraine, is that ratcheting up tensions across the strait would at least create some economic pain for China. I think the more general impact of the Chinese economic troubles is, again, it is an effect on the view in Taiwan that the way to economic success is integration with China. So, I mean, until recently, the discourse in Taiwan was, how much political risk are you willing to bear for the economic gains that come from engagement with China? And then you've seen this growing sense that the economic gains from engagement with China are not all they're cracked up to be, and that's partly the kind of complaints that many foreign investors and foreign traders have with China, but it's also particularly that Taiwan is sort of at the front line of that, and has now had this conscious strategy not only of reducing political risk, but also of saying that the economic challenges that it faces now in an era of decoupling, in an era of trying to be the world trying to be less dependent on China, and an era where the U.S. is trying to cut off certain links, right? The high-tech limits that split TSMC and others in a very difficult position. So Taiwan just now faces an environment where the combination of U.S.-China frictions and China's own economic troubles make a not purely political argument for less dependence on China more saleable in Taiwan.
Thank you all. This was a great discussion. Thank you all for coming. Michael's going to conclude with a few reminders.
Well, I was just going to say the same thing, so thank you so much all for coming, and thank you especially, Tom, for moderating.